This is George Galloway for Kalima Horra on الميادين television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting Kalima Horra, where every word is true. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on الميادين television, coming to you from London, where I have assembled an audience of experts and some gifted amateurs like me. Tonight we're talking about Venezuela, the threat of a good example. You see, the reason the United States government has borne such unremitting hostility to the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela is nothing to do with love for the Venezuelan people and everything to do with hatred of any demonstration that anything other than absolute Yankee domination of a Latin American country is permissible. Long ago, a man called Monroe articulated what he called the Monroe Doctrine. It designated all of Latin America as the United States' backyard. Now, frankly, nobody is prepared to be anybody's backyard. Backyard is where you keep the trash, where you throw out the garbage, and nobody in Latin America considers themselves that way. The United States was forced to reinforce and sometimes establish some of the grimmest, most brutal tyrannies and dictatorship throughout Latin America for many decades in order to keep Latin America as their backyard. There was no grisly generalissimo so brutal that any government, Democrat or Republican, in the United States would not support them. Indeed, they articulated a new doctrine. Sometimes when one did, like in Chile in 1972, when the government of popular unity led by the president Salvador Allende came to power and challenged American hegemony in Latin America, they simply overthrew him. They murdered him in the presidential palace, though he was the democratically elected president of the country. They murdered many members of parliament, and they rounded up the supporters of the elected president in a football stadium and tortured and murdered them. And the United States allowed it, and indeed other Western countries did too. But one by one, inch by inch, the people of Latin America have begun to free themselves from that Yankee domination. The first bastion was Cuba, about which more later. But the second most important bastion was in Venezuela. And the Venezuelan effect began to cascade throughout the subcontinent. And one after another, countries of the center-left, even left governments came to power and began to transform the lives of their people. Now, the Venezuelan effect was widely centered around the enormous, gigantic, titanic personality of the late President Hugo Chavez. He was quite simply an unstoppable force, a force of nature, a man of the people, a military man, but a man in himself an emblem of the Venezuelan population. He was mixed race and actually contained within his own person all of the different mixes in Venezuela. He had an indigenous, so-called Indian past, genetic trail. He had a black trail in his background. He had a white trail from the Spanish immigrants and original occupiers of Venezuela. He was simply the most captivating, charismatic, powerful political leader I have ever seen at work, and I've seen some powerful leaders at work. And his popularity amongst the masses in Venezuela was unbeatable, and he won 8 elections and referenda in that country, despite the traditional oligarchy of the country and their United States backers doing everything that they could to try and stop him, including military coup d'etat, which at one stage saw him incarcerated before popular resistance and response reinstated him in the presidential palace. But the one thing that President Chavez could not stop was the illness which killed him. I had the great honor to campaign with him in the last of his 8 victories. They threw everything, including the kitchen sink, as we say in England, to try and stop him. But he won yet another thumping majority. But illness took him, as it has taken and afflicted many of the great leaders in Latin America. I'm not a conspiracy theorist myself, but makes you think how one after the other these great leaders went down unexpectedly in the way that they did. But the Bolivarian revolutionary force, which was the base of President Chavez, continues to rule Venezuela today. And President Nicolas Maduro, who is a friend of mine, I knew him when he was a bus driver, a trade union leader, a foreign minister, and now he is the president of the state. But the attempts to overthrow the revolution in Venezuela continue. The oligarchy is rich and strong and hates this revolution with a vengeance because it has taken the wealth that they used to take for granted from Venezuela's phenomenal oil resources and distributed that wealth amongst the poorest people in the state. Therefore, Venezuela, it can truthfully be said, is a country where the poorest people, the working people, the ethnic minority populations are 100% behind the government, and the richest people are 100% against it. And the problem is they have the United States government behind them. Cuba, for so long a thorn in the side of the United States, President Fidel Castro was subject to hundreds, literally hundreds of attempts to murder him. He even had to endure a United States-backed invasion of his country in the early 1960s. The United States government has decided to take Cuba off the list of countries supposedly supporting terrorism, has decided to reopen diplomatic relations with Cuba and build a new future in its relations with Cuba, but has instead transferred all of that to Venezuela. Venezuela is now on the list of countries supposedly sponsoring terrorism. They have no diplomatic relations with Venezuela, and President Obama, almost with the same pen that he signed the end of the conflict with Cuba, has now signed a document opening a new era of conflict with Venezuela, describing Venezuela as an enemy state, which is a bit tricky because the United States actually gets most of its oil from Venezuela, and it's not going to stop buying it. It's buying it now from an enemy state that it accuses of supporting terrorism. So we're here tonight, here in London, to discuss Venezuela, why it is such a good example and why it is such a threat to the attempts by the United States to re-establish their former hegemony in what they insultingly call their backyard. I've got this audience here who are itching to go. I'll be right back after this. You're watching Kalima Horra for Al-Miadeen Television with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London. We're discussing the new chapter in United States aggression against Venezuela. They are openly supporting, with huge amounts of money and informational propaganda power, the Venezuelan opposition, which represents the richest Venezuelans who've been robbed, they believe, of their traditional lion's share of Venezuela's oil wealth. But they are doing more than that. They are now stepping up diplomatic, political sanctions against Venezuela, and it can't be long before the guns get broken out. At least that's how it looks to me. Let's see what the audience think. Let's take the first contributor. Yes, sir, you with President Chavez on your chest.
Hi, George. Do you think the repercussions of the Panama summit will result in Obama and the US actually withdrawing or repelling the executive order?
Well, they have a problem that almost everybody in the Latin American subcontinent opposes their policy towards Venezuela, as indeed it came to oppose their policy towards Cuba. And it's the United States which is isolated, even amongst governments that are not demonstrably, at least, identifiably governments of the left. It is now hegemonic in Latin America that the subcontinent demands independence and sovereignty and will not be pushed around by the United States any longer. And this is a particular problem for President Obama. Maybe he's trying to balance the change in the policy on Cuba with a change for the worse on the policy on Venezuela. Maybe he's trying to assuage anger on the right in the United States about his new policy towards Iran on the nuclear question. The one thing that's obvious is that the people who pay the bill are the ordinary people of Venezuela, because these sanctions, this aggression, and this thinly veiled threat of action against the popular choice, I stress this point, just as Allende was the elected president of Chile, which was a government that was overthrown on 9/11, the original 9/11 in 1973, so President Maduro is the elected president of the country, and yet we have this behemoth to the north openly threatening the political choice, the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. Who's on next? Yes, sir.
Hello, George. Alan Woods from the Hands Off Venezuela campaign. I was going to ask two questions, but you've answered the first one, I think.
Ask away. We can never have enough.
That's true. I was going to ask about how would you explain the timing of this threat, which I think is clearly related to the question of Cuba. The second question I would ask, what steps, in your opinion, should be taken to answer this threat, and specifically coming from a solidarity campaign, an international campaign, as I am, what steps do you think that we should take in Britain in order to protest and to combat this aggression?
Well, I always ask people in audiences when I'm discussing this question, how will you feel if you turn on the radio one morning and discover that the United States has managed to overthrow the popular elected socialist government of Venezuela? How will you feel if these gold-toothed emigres from Miami are back in power, back with their hands in the honeypot? Because, of course, there's no such thing as a free hand in the honeypot, the losers will be the very poorest. You know very well, probably better than me, the transformative effect that this revolution has had for the masses in Venezuela. Schools, hundreds and hundreds of schools, universities, more universities per head of population than any country on the earth. And school children, every one of them, being given a computer. My goodness, I wish we had that here in Britain. The housing, President Chavez's last election campaign pledged a dignified house for every Venezuelan. Building houses everywhere for ordinary people, for poor people. And you know well, the rich hate that because before Chavez, they got all the wealth and they lived a kind of double life in the United States and in Venezuela. Their money, they kept it, of course, some of it in Venezuela, but most of it they spent and invested in property and so on in the United States. This evil oligarchy is seeking to come back to power. So what are we going to do about it? The answer is to help campaigns like yours and the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign to spread awareness of what the United States is up to here. Go to Venezuela, buy Venezuelan goods, and support the big international effort at solidarity behind this revolution. And know that it's Venezuela today, it'll be somewhere else tomorrow. Any government, even a British one, might sound far-fetched. If Britain had a government like the government of Maduro and Chavez before him, the United States would try and overthrow it. They have no limits. They don't want people to come to know that there is another way of doing things, that another way, a better way, is possible. So they attempt to strangle at birth, and if not at birth, then at any stage. Strangle at birth any good example, any alternative model that is produced. Does that answer your point?
Yes, there's a lot more to say, but there we are.
There is more to say. Let me deal with the first part of what you said. It is, of course, directly related to the Cuban question. They have effectively ended the long Cold War, which was sometimes a hot war, with Cuba. And there's a big lobby, especially in the state of Florida, a decisive presidential battleground always, a lot of opposition to it. A lot of the people who hated Cuba because they lost everything when the Cuban Revolution kicked out the mafia, kicked out its local acolytes. They're furious about the new policy on Cuba. Another group in the United States is furious about Obama making a deal with Iran and the permanent 5+1 on the nuclear question. So, in one sense, he's throwing a bone to those lobbies. Say, well, I might be going soft on Cuba and Iran, but I sure am mean and ugly when it comes to Venezuela. We must just hope that the Venezuelan people can maintain their unity and their dignity in opposition to this aggression. But there's an overarching point here. Do we want to live in a world where the United States decides who the government is and what that government does? Do we want to live in a world where the United States is the superpower, only superpower, which dictates to all and sundry what they should do, which designates all and sundry as rogue states, failed states, terrorist states, or whatever other kind of insults they want to throw? My guess is that the vast majority of people in the world do not want such a world. They want a world where power is shared, where equilibrium is evident everywhere, and that no one can dictate to anyone else. Who else would like to come in? Yes, the lady behind.
Hi, George. My name is Rosie, and I thought until latterly that I was well-read or well-educated, and then I realised that I know absolutely nothing really about the true situation in Venezuela, and why is it, and how is it, that it's not reported in the mainstream media?
Well, the mainstream media has little interest in Latin America per se. It's a long way off, and although it's an emerging market of very great importance, there's almost no journalistic inquiry into events in Latin America. You can go a long, long time between serious television, radio, or printed matter on events in Latin America. There is one exception, or two, but one in particular. You might be surprised to hear me say this. I really hate liberals. I hate liberals. I don't mean the capital L Liberal Party. I hate them too. I hate liberals and their media. The one unremitting source of hostility against the Venezuelan revolution from the beginning is in the liberal press in the United Kingdom, particularly in The Guardian. It is utterly shameful and inexplicable. It is inexplicable how a newspaper which calls itself progressive, calls itself liberal, is actually the main spear through which, by which, along which the United States' policy is transmitted to liberal and progressive readers. So that Malcolm X had a sort of rhyme about this, that if you're not careful, the media will have you hating the oppressed and loving the oppressors. And that's exactly what's happened amongst the liberal literati, glitterati in Britain. They actually hate Venezuela more than the right-wing politicians do. And every so-called human rights issue or the shortage of this or that commodity, I mean, The Guardian was banging on the other day trying to delegitimize the Venezuelan revolution because there was a shortage of toilet paper. Well, actually, The Guardian could have been used instead of the toilet paper, if you ask me. So you have to be in the solidarity movements, like the gentleman's at the front here. You have to search on the internet. You have to look to alternative media if you're going to find the truth about Venezuela. You won't find it in the mainstream media, and you certainly won't find it in the liberal media. Who's next? Yes, gentleman at the end.
Hi, good evening, George. I think you briefly touched on some of the notes about the solidarity campaign, but what steps can parents and other educators take to, promote the awareness that the US is not our friend, given, what we hear about in the media and other sources? What steps can parents and educators at least do to spread awareness for the next generation that, there is another side to the story?
That's a very good question. We have and ought to have no hatred of the people of the United States. I myself am the great-grandson of the only woman in the entire 19th century who emigrated from America to Scotland, to Dundee. I think she got on the wrong boat in New York Harbour when millions were sailing in the other direction. She sailed to Dundee. And although I love Dundee, it was an odd choice. New York, Dundee. And we must, only a fool would not, admire the achievements of the people of the United States. Their industrial achievements, scientific achievements, cultural achievements, sporting achievements, some of the greatest people of the last few centuries have come from the United States, and we must acknowledge that. And so we must also recognize that we share a common language, or as Oscar Wilde put it, we're divided by a common language, and we should recognize important shared histories and so on. We just don't want to be ruled by the United States, that's all. We have significant cultural and especially ideological differences with the United States. These must be acknowledged. But the United States is thousands of miles away, and it's a completely absurd idea that we in Britain should be somehow umbilically tied to the United States, which doesn't even want us to be anyway, has its ambitions elsewhere. So the key point for me is this word hegemony. I reject the United States hegemony. I'm ready to be close to the people of the United States. I feel close to them. I travel there, speak there, all over the country, to big audiences. But I will not be dictated to by the governments of the United States, whether in the form of the imbecile George W. Bush or the professor Barack Obama. It doesn't matter to me. It's their business who their president is, but it's our business not to allow ourselves to be dominated by and dictated to by them. And we more readily understand that in the Middle East context. There are not many takers in Britain, or anywhere else for that matter, for the United States policy towards the Middle East. Its endless subventions to the rogue state of Israel, its endless arming and backing and so on. People kind of instinctively already now know that, though they didn't always, that the United States is up to no good in the Middle East. Yet, in Latin America, they haven't yet quite grasped that. And in Africa also, where the United States is absolutely up to no good, they haven't yet caught up with that either. So it's important that educated people who, by which I don't mean university. I left school at 16, so I'm actually not educated. I educated myself, and everyone can educate themselves. And it's important that programs like this encourage that. And as the young lady said earlier, it turns out she doesn't know as much as she needs to know about things like Venezuela, but I'm sure that she will in future. We're discussing Venezuela because the United States has effectively just declared a kind of war on Venezuela. Just as it ended the war with Cuba, it's ready to begin a new one with Venezuela. It's not a shooting war yet, but how long before the US financed and backed opposition elements in Venezuela make a physical push for power in the state, ending a long and glorious period of the Bolivarian Revolution. That's what we're discussing here, and I'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London and discussing Venezuela and President Obama's executive order, which effectively was a kind of declaration of war against the state, which so many people around the world, including in the Arab world, where this is mainly being watched, admire so greatly. Many Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians are living in Venezuela and are an honored part of the Venezuelan community. And President Chavez and President Maduro have stood firmly by the rights, the legitimate rights of the Arab people in the many conflicts that have stricken the region. I've got an educated, expert audience with me this evening, and the next speaker, sir, is you.
My name's Nico. Hi, George. When you're out campaigning on the doorstep or at political rallies, do you find that regular voters are really interested in foreign issues, whether it be Venezuela or the Palestinian territories?
British people are not as interested in foreign affairs as they should be, and the British Parliament's not as interested in foreign affairs as it once was. I've been a member of Parliament for almost 30 years, and 30 years ago, Foreign Office Questions was almost as busy as Prime Minister's Questions, not quite, but almost as busy. And there were a large number of parliamentarians with questions to the Foreign Secretary, who was a figure in the land, about the very many issues raging across the world that, of course, were not just interesting and important in themselves, but, of course, impacted on us directly and indirectly. Now the Foreign Secretary of Britain is not even a legend in his own street. I'm struggling to remember who the current Foreign Secretary is, and the shadow Foreign Secretary looks as if he's about to lose his seat in Parliament, and therefore will be the ex-shadow Foreign Secretary. The shadow Foreign Secretary who never made it to the office, Alan. The last time that happened was Patrick Gordon Walker in the early 1960s. So it's a measure of how shrunken has become the issue of foreign affairs in the Parliament, reflecting, I think, malaise that exists in the media. As the media has had less and less budget to employ foreign correspondents, they have covered foreign affairs less and less, perhaps inevitably. But paradoxically, there are more individual citizens in the state interested in foreign affairs than there have ever been. There was a lot in Parliament before, there was a lot of foreign correspondence before, but the number of citizens well informed on what's happening in the world was much less than it is today. And the answer to that is social media. I have 1 million followers on social media. If I made a message now on this or that foreign affairs issue, 1 million people would instantly receive it. And many of them would respond to it. It would strike a chord. Of course, in Britain, there are certain foreign affairs topics which have more resonance in one place rather than another. The Latin American community in London, for example, is huge. Spanish and Portuguese is very widely spoken in London, which is a city where the minorities are the majority. 53% of the population of London are minority populations. We have many Latin American solidarity campaigns, the Cuban campaign, at least 2 Venezuelan campaigns, a Bolivian campaign, and so on. Maybe we need to do more united work, as happens at least once a year. I speak at it every year, a conference which tries to draw all these different issues in Latin America together. Yes, do you want to come back?
Do you think that you've been able to tap into that Muslim world community that you've been just talking about partly by standing up against America, by attacking America?
No, it's the other way around. Muslims like me because I stand up for them. I don't stand up for them because they like me. I was, for almost 20 years, a member of Parliament in Glasgow in a constituency that was 99% white and non-Muslim. Maybe there were a few dozen Muslims in my Glasgow constituency. But that didn't stop me taking the line that I take. And of course, having taken it, you win the respect and support of people elsewhere in the country. It's true that now that I'm the Member of Parliament for Bradford, it's like being in heaven without having to die, because everybody virtually in Bradford West constituency agrees with me entirely on the issue of Iraq, on the issue of Palestine. Hallelujah, that's what I say. Don't blame me for it. Yes, next.
Hi, my name is William. I came from Venezuela. I'm really interested in this subject that you are talking about. The events prior to this Las Americas summit were really interesting. I just want to explore your views on that specific week. The United States sent several envoys all across Latin America, diplomatics, to start stopping the campaign about Obama repeal the executive order. And they failed. They were overwhelmed by the solid bloc that Latin America construct in defense of Venezuela. They tried to pull the Venezuelan name out of the agenda of the summit. It's a way how to water down and cool down the subject, because they were not in capacity to answer all the demands of the Latin American bloc. And during the actual presentation of President Maduro, we saw the first time that a whole nation signed by name and last name, I am writing to you, President of the United States, you must respect us. 11 million people did that journey to get to that point. And the President of the United States find himself, I guess, against the wall. And he tried to send a special envoy called Tom Shannon to Caracas to negotiate with President Maduro a way out of this embarrassment of the presidency of the United States. Funny enough, the actual speech of President Maduro was exactly the speech that Tom Shannon received. And I just find this interesting point. The way how they defend their case is that they use threat as a pro form, as a nice way how to envelope the sanctions against 7 Chavistas. That was the minimum shape they can make it. And they try to just portray that Venezuela is not a threat. But even though, the only way they can sanction somebody is because they declare it an enemy. And because this sanction is a deterrent to a formal enemy, the sanction is enforced. So we Venezuelans are asking ourselves, is the President of the United States misusing U.S. law to get about a new stick to hit us in the face with the presumption that he's sanctioning 7 Chavistas? Is the President of the United States liable of fraud of the U.S. law as that great nation where he is not able to abide his own law and calling people enemies or threats just because he fancy? It's like a playing games. And we found that very insulting. And we ask the United States not only to repeal the executive order and apologize to the whole Latin America, because we found the timing very... we will analyze this for many years to come. They use the carrot with Cuba and the stick against Venezuela. And it's not just the proportional, unfair, totally unjustified, and it's using the most precious thing we need to defend, which is the human rights, defense of human rights, that nobody has to play about, and they are playing about. So, once Venezuela portray this against the United States, the President of the United States has to step back oh, Venezuela is not a threat. He has to say that publicly. So what is the reason for the national... No, yeah, exactly, what we are then. So we ask him, if we are not a threat, why are you declaring a national emergency in the United States because of us? Explain that. So the contradiction starts flourishing. Now the President Obama said he cannot retrieve what he already signed. And we said, we don't believe in you. We want you to take actions to repair the damage you have done to our reputation. Because there is a lot of people here that really believe that we deserve this type of labeling, and we don't. The second thing is, because we understand that the United States tried to use the carrot with Cuba and the stick with Venezuela just to portray himself as a good dominant force, or a sort of formative force, we found this the beginning of the ridicule, of the paranoia of fear, the contradiction on a country that is not a threat at all, that is not able to impose any damage on the United States, that is an admirer of the culture of the United States in many ways, is considered as a supplier of safe and secure oil, is a threat. It's just a ridicule. And this is the beginning for me, and maybe I want to explore this, is the beginning of the evidence, the tipping point when the paranoia, fear that the United States has played in the foreign policy for many, many years start to decline. It's just ridicule. It's nothing to say that.
Well, I hope that you're right. I believe that you're right, that the United States is not, as Chairman Mao very prematurely described it, as a paper tiger. It's not a paper tiger, still has teeth, but it's a fading tiger. It's a tiger that's in its last days and which can still growl, but it doesn't have the bite that it once had. The real reason for the invasion of Iraq was partly oil, of course, partly Israel, of course, partly currency issues and so on, but its real fundamental reason was to terrify the world with American power. But it achieved the opposite. It showed to the world the limits of the power of the United States, not the strengths of the United States. And many people learned from that, including in Venezuela, including in Latin America. This fading tiger is not capable of implementing its hegemonic writ in Latin America, still less anywhere else in the world. It was said to me in Venezuela that when George Bush was the president, the only way to get elected to office in Latin America was to be anti-George Bush, which was a transformation because, of course, you could never be in power in Latin America before unless you were pro the United States. That has now completely reversed. And the bloc response at the summit is another example of the solidarity of the people of Latin America, which has been long delayed by petty rivalries and nationalism, but mainly by United States efforts to isolate anyone who might take a different point of view to theirs. It's now over. We now have a hegemony in Latin America behind the idea of sovereignty, independence, a refusal to be dictated to. And the response and the way that the envoys were sent away with a flea in their ear, as we say here, sent packing and completely failed, is a further example of that. I don't believe myself that, this may be an unpopular view, that President Obama really wants to implement this executive order. I believe it's vulgar, petty politics, mainly for a domestic audience or a congressional audience. I don't believe that he wants to make a big confrontation with Venezuela. But that doesn't really exculpate him, because there are many heads in the United States power structure, many agencies who will make evil use of the fact that this designation has now been made. And in any case, there's another American president coming along in a minute. He only has 2 years left. And looking at the runners and riders in the presidential election, I'm not sure that I'd trust any of them with the future of Latin America, whether Democrat or Republican. So it's a grave thing that he's done. He needs to be absolutely condemned for it, irrespective of what its motivation is, because it could potentially pave the way for further confrontation in Latin America, between Latin America and the United States. We'll continue this debate right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Venezuela and the executive order that President Obama has signed for whatever reason, which could pave the way for an actual physical confrontation between the two powers, which will be tricky, not least because the United States gets most of its oil from the aforementioned Venezuela. We did take the camera out around the streets to just see what people thought. Here's what we found.
Venezuela is seen as a country that has massive potential, but all of that potential has been almost criminally wasted.
No.
Obama should take off Maduro in the government.
He thinks he knows what he's doing, but he doesn't. Like, he's not taking other people into consideration, which I think he should do.
Ele tem que fazer bloqueio total para poder tirar o Maduro de lá.
Why are they opposing it? Well, because Venezuela, of all Latin American countries, holds the northern seaboard on the Caribbean, just to the south of the United States. It's a very dominant geographical location. It's a major nation there, and of course, most obviously, it's a significant oil and gas producer, the Gulf of Maracaibo. And I suppose the United States doesn't like countries that have massive energy resources and are seen as sort of rogue nations, and particularly when they're on their doorstep. I'm not a fan of sanctions. I think sanctions against Russia are completely inappropriate, and sanctions against Venezuela will go exactly the same way.
The sanction doesn't really stop anything from happening, because the countries are still going to do what they want to do.
Well, that was the voice of the populace in London. This is the voice of the experts here in the studio this evening. And let's hear from the mother of all experts. Go ahead.
Oh, no, please don't give me that. Well, George, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We shared some work in the past together. My name is Luis Castro. For those who don't know me, I'm a documentary maker, filmmaker, news, etc., TV producer, and I'm Venezuelan. I was born in Venezuela. I'm probably the only person in this room that was in Venezuela working in media during the coup d'etat against President Chavez in 2002. So I do know from the inside a lot of the things that Venezuela has been suffering for the last 12 years since the time of Hugo Chavez raised into power in 1999, precisely. But more than me being an expert on any field, I want to talk about the issue of media and share a little bit of a Latin American history of Latin America in general with the United States. I do not think there's any region in the planet that have suffered the United States more than us. More than 150 years of history with these people always, as you rightfully introduced at the beginning, following the Monroe Doctrine, that we are supposed to be some sort of experiment yard for anything the United States wants to run across the world. And that's why it is important to understand this, because this is not a Latin American issue. I have made comments with colleagues in the past and recently after all this Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, that the knock-on effect of President Chavez's presidency, the Bolivarian revolution, the rise of people like Evo Morales in Bolivia, Correa, the Kirchners in Argentina, has led the United States to do what they are doing right now, which is like trying to find another backyard in the Middle East or maybe in Europe itself. Because after exhausting the Middle East in conflicts in Libya, Syria, trying to get a deal, a conflict with Iran, Palestine, and so on, they have come even to Europe to try to implement their capitalist monetarian revolution, as they want to call it. With and still is ridiculous, is insulting, as William was describing, the way they actually treat the planet. As in, like, okay, let's go to Europe as a last resort for market because, well, now Latin America doesn't work. In the Middle East, we can't do anything. We can't do anything with Africa. And obviously, the Far East is not an option because the Japanese and Chinese will never allow them to do what they do. So they started here with the, let's say, smaller countries, like they did in Greece, they did it in Portugal, they did in Iceland, Ireland, so on, and they tried it in Spain. They even tried it to implement it in Italy, but it didn't work out, and so on. So the length of the arm of the United States is endless. We have suffered for 150 years, and it's important for you to understand the importance of the Bolivarian Revolution because we literally kick their influence out of the continent. From the moment the people like President Lula, I remember vividly, there's a film from Oliver Stone that you might want to see if you haven't, The South of the Border, that Oliver Stone interviewed all the Latin American revolutionaries, Chavez, Cristina, Lula, and Lula said himself to the camera that the FMI came to him and asked him to reconcile the debt and sort of like, no, why do you want to pay it off? No, let's work it out and we will give you like more time. And President Lula, with the reserve that he had gained in Brazil, just said, no, give me the sum and get out of here. And from that moment, miraculously, Brazil started to emerge economically and became what it is right now. With this problem, with our problems, we don't say that Venezuela doesn't have problems, but we do have a conscious, I hope so, that the United States is up to no good whatsoever in Latin America ever. So nothing that they can say to us, at least on our side, can convince me that they want democracy for Venezuela or they want democracy for Latin America. And if we're going to talk about democracy, which I think you have roughly touched the point as well, well, I think globally, and this involves people from Britain, from Lebanon, people from everywhere, we need to start demanding world democracy. And the world democracy will begin the day that the United Nations change this silly structure where we are kidnapped by 5 countries that they think they can overrule the wishes of the majority. It happened in Cuba. That for the last 3 or 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, the United Nations Assembly has voted unanimously, 185 countries, including Britain, to end the blockade in Cuba, and only because the United States of America, backed up by the best friends of Israel, they say, no, we don't want. So how can they even go out in the media to talk about democracy when they are the most anti-democratic country in the planet? When they just go and talk about democracy, and they get their noses in other countries like they do in Syria, like they're doing in Libya, and God forbid, as you say, I'm not a conspiracy myself, but I started to doubt when I saw the first rout of ISIS around the continent. I'm starting to doubt that they are not even behind this at some point. But well, this is to be proven. As everything in the history of the United States, we will always discover something 50 years in time, as we just heard from the Kennedy files and how he was supposed to be killed. So I just want to conclude my intervention by saying the most important thing is that, as you said, yeah, there are there is alternative people in the media right now, giving alternative voice. The mainstream media, even for Latin America, for those you know, there are channels across the world which include Russia, Iran, even China, and surprisingly Germany recently. They have channels in Spanish. So they are interested in what's going on in there. Stop listening to CNN and Fox News, and there's no good. I have reached the point that I just switch off the television when I hear them because I can't stand them anymore.
Bravo, bravo. I think the audience reaction tells you that not just the people in this studio, but people, the millions who will watch this show, will also be applauding what you said in their living rooms, because this rejection, this spirit of rejection of foreign domination is itself now becoming hegemonic in the world. And more importantly, it's no longer incoherent. People have means by which they can express it. Your television work, Russian, Iranian, al-Miadin for the Arab-speaking audience, or just popular citizens' journalism. This kind of spirit that you exemplify is now bursting out everywhere, and they cannot contain it. It's ironic. Marx said that capitalism would provide its own grave diggers. And the new technology, which has been brought to us by capitalism, brought to us by the imperialist countries, is digging the grave of those very same imperialist countries. And I believe that the future is ours, that the United States is a fading empire, and that a new world order with equilibrium and multipolar world. I mean, the fact that you touched on, that the United Nations Security Council has 5 members entirely based upon their possession of nuclear weapons and their role in winning the Second World War, except for China, which was later added. Why is Britain on the Security Council of the United Nations, a bankrupt country of 65 million people? There is no other reason other than their possession of nuclear weapons, their role in the Second World War, which was indeed an heroic one. But that was a very long time ago. How can Britain be on the Security Council while Brazil is not? How can the entirety of the Latin American subcontinent not be on the Security Council, not have a veto? Why should there be any veto? Why can't we have this world democracy that you are talking about? All of these things are widely shared in the world, and we now have the means to express them. Alan.
Yes, but first of all, I don't know, did you read The Economist, what they had to say about this latest
I didn't.
escapade?
Tell us, please.
Yes, I think you'd find this interesting. It was the kind of diplomatic clumsiness for which the United States has a unique capacity. On March the 9th, Barack Obama issued an executive order declaring a national emergency because of the, quote, extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States posed by Venezuela. Is Uncle Sam really scared of a country in Latin America that's a fraction of its size, with an army that is minuscule when compared to the military might of the North American Colossus? This is The Economist, which is hardly a progressive or left-wing journal. But what I wanted to say to back up George's excellent analysis is this. I had the enormous pleasure and honor of forming an acquaintance with Hugo Chavez for the last 10 years of his life. And I subscribe entirely to everything that George said about this extraordinary person. But the question I wanted to raise is this. I've been around, I don't know how long. I hesitate to ask how old you are, George, but anyway. I'm 70, so I beat you. So I cannot remember any person being subjected to such a sustained and vicious campaign of character assassination in Hugo Chavez. It's not surprising that people in this country, I didn't see what was said there, but I'm not surprised if they have a hostile attitude. Because of this outpour, constant distortions, constant insult. First of all, he was supposed to be a dictator. Now, Hugo Chavez actually, in the course of his life, won more elections and popular consultations than any other leader on a world scale. So don't swallow this business about a dictator. Hugo Chavez was not a dictator. Then I noticed when he died, and tragically 2 years ago, they somewhat softened the line, George. I don't know if you noticed that. They didn't say that he was a dictator. I was in Spain at the time, actually, where the press is particularly vicious. But they had another line. Oh, he's the man that wrecked the Venezuelan economy. That's the line, you know. Here's a country swimming on oil wealth, should be prosperous, should be rich. That's true. Venezuela has always been sitting on a sea of oil and has always been dirt poor. And for the first time in its history, Chavez was attempting to spread this wealth and assist the poor people in society. What's the argument? Oh, he spent this oil irresponsibly. What's the definition of irresponsible expenditure on oil, George? Irresponsible, from their point of view, expenditure on housing, on schools, on hospitals, on universities. That's irresponsible. Wasting public money. They actually said that, the insolence to say this. Of course, in Spain and in Britain, we don't waste money, do we? You know, we spend money responsibly. We run the economy responsibly. What do we do with the money? We give it to the bankers. That's the responsible definition. And of course, there's no money left for schools, hospitals, health, or anything else. This is standing the truth entirely on its head. But I just wanted to say one thing. We're facing an election, as you well know, George, in a couple of weeks' time. And the fact of the matter is, people, the great majority of the people of Britain could not care less, with the exception of Scotland, which is a different. They couldn't care less. They turned off. I've spoken to people in this audience who said to, one of them said to me, well, I'm not really interested in politics. I'm not surprised. What you mean to say is not that you're not interested in politics. You're not interested in this politics. What a contrast with Venezuela. You can say what you like, and you can think what you like. But every election in Venezuela was hardly fought. There was enormous interest, enormous enthusiasm, enormous passion. 10 years ago, I took an initiative. I launched the Hands Off Venezuela campaign. By the way, we were the only ones at that stage, George. The left, I'm ashamed to say, didn't pay any attention to Venezuela. They didn't understand what was occurring. Only belatedly that was taken up. We've organised big rallies. There was a meeting in Vienna that we organised a few years ago with Chavez. I was on the platform with Chavez and one of the daughters of Che Guevara. 5,000 young people turned up, not just from Austria to here. And what enthusiasm! Let nobody tell me that people are not interested in politics, George. Let nobody tell me that the young people are not. They're not interested because they're offered nothing. What
I say, Alan, is that the young people are not apathetic. They're apoplectic at the pathetic nature of the political class.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. Very, very excellent summation. A brilliant summation of not just politics in Latin America, but also in Britain. Thank you very much for that. We'll be right back after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing Venezuela. Experts in the audience have toured the horizon, not just of Latin America either, but world politics and politicians. Let's hear from the young lady at the front.
Hi, George. There were a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you. So basically, why the real change in Obama's outlook on Cuba, and why, and I think you've answered this one, why the difference in relationship between Venezuela, who is an oil provider, and somebody like Saudi, who you have spoken about quite a lot, who also provides oil. But I think you were really fortunate, and I did see you when you campaigned with Chavez in the last election. You and your wife were out there. And I think this is too great an opportunity to not ask you to actually share some of, your personal experiences with Hugo Chavez. What was he like? Because he came across as a very charismatic leader, very humble. And, is there anything from your personal relationship with him that you can share with us? Because I think we'd be honoured to hear it.
Well, Alan has given you a taste of that, and I tried to earlier. He was quite a unique person. I don't think, other than Fidel Castro, that I've met anyone in the same league as him. He was unbelievably warm. He, on the campaign trail, was so magnetic. People would burst into tears. He touched the hearts. Corazón del pueblo is what they sing, the heart of the people. He touched the hearts of the people. He was the heart of the people. And the poorer the person, the more they loved him. The blacker the person, the more they loved him. The more indigenous the person, the more they loved him. The disabled, whom he rescued from absolute, total neglect under previous regimes, gave them everything. Disabled centers, wheelchairs, health care, and so on. Much of it, by the way, provided by Cuban doctors sent to Venezuela in solidarity. I mean, it was overwhelming. Alan and I are old practitioners and believers in class politics, but you never saw class politics anywhere like you saw them in Venezuela. Liking a good dinner, I would sometimes go to the other side of town to a fancy restaurant, a restaurant that most Venezuelans couldn't afford to eat in, except the oligarchy. And there the air was blue with hatred for Chavez. Blue! I'd hope that none of them saw my picture on the television or in the papers. Quite spoiled my dinner, the atmosphere. So it's an absolute iron division. The oligarchy and those that feed off it hated Chavez, hate Maduro, and the poor and those whose lives had begun to be transformed. And a very important point that was made by one of our Venezuelans earlier, maybe both. There are still many problems in Venezuela. The life of the people has not been transformed entirely. The problems that they have are, in my opinion, I don't want to spark a division with Alan, but are problems of the socialist method, rather than problems necessarily of the Bolivarian Revolution or Venezuela, perhaps too statist, perhaps too bureaucratic, perhaps too sclerotic, sluggish in some respects. There are shortages of things in Venezuela that there should not be shortages of. But, of course, a revolutionary transformation cannot depend on one man, because all men, women are mortal. And although Chavez was my age when he died, and we could have expected some more years, in the end, the revolution has to be passed on. And that's where the proof of the pudding will be. Let's take gentleman at the back.
Hi, George. My name's Akib. You talked about Hugo Chavez and the great personality that he had and the great charisma that he had. Do you think it's the case that the United States sees Nicolas Maduro as a soft touch and they're just, testing the waters to see how far they can push him, and whether he can galvanize the rest of the Latin American states the way that Hugo Chavez did to stand up to the United States? Does he have that in him? Does he have that personality? Does he have that gravitas?
Well, there's no second Hugo Chavez, not anywhere in the world. Such a man doesn't come up. Although Maduro was a bus driver, they don't come along in twos and threes. So Maduro is less than Chavez as a charismatic performer, as an unstoppable force of nature. But he's very far from being a soft touch. As a matter of fact, he's harder than Chavez. His politics are harder than Chavez. So they won't be able to undermine him in the sense of undermining his determination to see the revolution through. Quite the contrary. They might actually have been able to get Chavez to compromise on one or two things more easily than they will Maduro, who's not a compromising sort, in my experience. No, I think it's partly that, I mean, I was in the United States in New York when President Chavez came, minus his bodyguards, to the United Nations General Assembly because the US refused visas to his bodyguards. So he went walking in the streets of New York without any bodyguards. And thousands of people mobbed him. People of all kinds mobbed him with adulation and love. President Obama, nor Bush before him, especially Bush before him, couldn't step out of their limousine without a phalanx of armed troopers, some of whom might have taken a shot at him themselves, but the idea that a foreign president could roam around New York being mobbed by thousands, and that Chavez could have done that in any capital city in the entire world without any security at all. And this must be very galling for the United States. How come such a leader, how come such a man with such a program and such a determination to see it through is actually popular? Because it suits them. Alan made the point. They called him a dictator. He won more elections than anybody else on the planet. No politician ever won more elections and referenda than him. And this is the threat of the good example that I described. Luis.
About the creation of an image, the very same topic that we are discussing here today about the U.S. sanctions in Venezuela is another example of what's going on. Because realistically, the sanctions are against seven or eight diplomatics or members of the government of Venezuela. So the sanctions are not the sanctions like the sanctions against Iran, that they are blocked from the banking international system, or the sanctions against Cuba. So Venezuela is not suffering from any of that, realistically. However, like as you guys here in Europe, for instance, the only thing you hear is U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. Immediately, your mind goes to, well, about, if I'm not mistaken,
rogue state.
Yeah, rogue state, terrorists. It's like they're probably sponsoring this and this and that, and it's another step forward, apart from the sabotage campaign, apart from the media, etc., that we should be able to always identify and not get fooled by it, and not carry on, following the same line and repeating ourselves, which is the worst mistake we can make, and maybe get it out of here and sort of like say, the U.S. has sanctions on Venezuela, because just a phrase brings things that are not really, true.
Excellent. Who else would like to contribute? Anyone who's not spoken yet would like to? Yes, gentleman behind in the middle row.
Hi, George.
Hi.
My name's Hussein. I'm from the Middlesex University Global South Solidarity Society. I was just wondering, after 9/11, the one in America, not in Chile, there was a list that was written by the American security, I'm not sure exactly what they're called, where they put, I think it was 7 or 8 countries, Muslim countries, that they were going to take out.
Is this their axis of evil?
Yeah, the axis of evil, is it? They've done quite well in a way. They've taken out quite a lot of anti-American governments. Do you think that this is going to, now when they've pushed it as far as they can, they're going to try and do the same with South America?
I feel that they don't have the capacity to do it. And even in their original axis of evil, as a matter of fact, they haven't done that well. Iran is still standing, still absolutely determined to insist upon its national rights, and will not be moved, will not be overthrown. There will be no regime change in Iran. North Korea was another part of this axis, and just as Iraq was invaded because it didn't have weapons of mass destruction, North Korea will not be invaded because it does have weapons of mass destruction. So that's not going anywhere either. So in a way, their axis of evil and the efforts that they made has, again, as I said earlier, demonstrated the extent of their limitation of their power rather than the extent of it. And as we've heard, especially from our Latin American guests this evening in the audience, there's absolute unity amongst all the countries of Latin America not to allow Venezuela to be victimized. As indeed, in recent years, there has been that unanimity that Cuba must be allowed into the continental institutions that the United States had kept them out of for such a long time. Now, I hope that no one watching this is wondering why an Arabic television station on a program hosted by a British man is coming from London talking about Venezuela. If you are confused by that, I have failed, because it was my intention when choosing this subject to make it clear that Venezuela is not only a Latin American subject, because the right of self-determination of people, the sovereign right to independence, and the rejection of foreign domination over their resources and their interests is a universal question. And you in the Arab world know that almost more than anybody else. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Al Miadin Television from London. Thank you very much.